Hello, my friend, and welcome to the study. Today we're going to look a little bit at the Old Norse language and do some writing. So we're just going to have an overview of the history, courtesy of Oren Robinson, and of course our anchor Atlas of World History. And then we'll write some runes. So there will be lots of book sounds, some maps, and pen and paper. And we'll also read a little bit of the Edda, the prose Edda. We'll read about when Thor met the giant Skrymir. So relax and let's have a look at what was happening in Old Norse. During the age of the Great Migrations, when many Germanic groups were migrating from the ancestral homeland in the north, the ancestors of the speakers of Old Norse stayed close to home. There were some movements within that area, such as the Danes who moved south out of southern Sweden into Zeeland and Jutland Peninsula. And the Swedes, meanwhile, were one of several groups occupying modern Sweden. They set about conquering their neighbours, the Geats, and expanded their power base through central Sweden and Gotland. It was about the mid-8th century that the rest of Europe began to know these groups as the Vikings. They were professional sea pirates and raiders who came onto areas without warning and attacked, sacked, and carried away any treasure they could lay their hands on. They began an even greater series of attacks and expanded to Ireland and England. The Shetlands and Orkneys had bases there. It is the progress of the Norwegian Vikings that is most recorded. They were responsible for exploring the south of England in a raid in 789, which resulted in the death of a sheriff, and renowned for their sack of the Lindisfarne Monastery in northeastern England in 793. About 40 years after the Norwegians, the Danes came onto the scene. In 845, they attacked and looted Hamburg, and throughout the 9th century, they were a scourge to the Low Countries and northern France especially. Advancing up the Seine as far as Paris, and up the Rhine and Moselle as far as Trier. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls this great Dane army that arrived in 851 and in 865 to winter in England, with no intention of leaving soon. And for the next 10 years, by 876 or 877 the kingdom of Northumbria and most of eastern Mercia was under Danish control or Danelaw. In 878 the Danes briefly captured most of what remained of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex, and it was not until Alfred the Great forced them to leave their kingdom later that same year, and they took East Anglia as a consolation prize. This was the beginning of a long conquest and relenting relationship between the Norse and the English. In the 980s, a large army of mixed Scandinavian nationalities under Danish kings began another series of devastating attacks on the island kingdom and on the shores of France. These ultimately led to the interruption of the Anglo-Saxon dynasty and the accession in 1016 of a Danish king, Knut or Canute, to the throne of all of England. This lasted until 1042, not long before the Norman conquest itself in 1066. The Duchy of Normandy had been a creation of the Danish Vikings, perhaps under a Norwegian chief, to whom France had ceded the region in 911. By the time they took control of England, however, the descendants of these Vikings were more French than Danish, and they spoke an Old French dialect. Even though the old ancestral relationship was still recognized, these Vikings had not only been pirates and conquerors, but they also had been explorers. They had pushed westward, far out of sight of land, discovered the Faroe Islands in the late 9th century, and Iceland. The first settlement in Iceland is dated to 874, and by the mid-century, about 50,000 people were living there. Greenland is said to have been discovered in 981 by Eric the Red, who had been banished from Iceland for manslaughter. Although the Swedes did not participate to any great extent in the event's exploration, they were not altogether inactive. If the Danes and Norwegians can be described as mercantile pirates, the Swedes are better characterized as piratical merchants. Even before the Viking Age, Swedes had established profitable trading towns on the Baltic, whence they carried out a trade in furs, cloth, spices, jewels, precious metals, and slaves, with peoples as far away as Constantinople and Arabia. Their principal trading routes lay through what is now Russia, especially along the Dnieper and Volga rivers. Some have claimed that the Swedes, under the name Rus, for their red hair, are responsible for founding the major cities such as Novgorod and Kiev, and thus for the earliest impetus toward a Russian state. The relationship of the Swedes with their trading partners was not always peaceful. From 860 on, Greek and Arab sources report occasional raids by Vikings. Additionally, the Swedes, along with Norwegians and even Icelanders, frequently hired out mercenaries. They formed the backbone of the Byzantine emperor's Varangian Guard in Constantinople. Christianity first came to Denmark, where it was generally introduced by the mid-10th century, then arrived in Norway, being declared the state religion there in 995. In Iceland, Christianity was declared the state religion in the mid-12th century, in about 1000. And finally, Sweden, the new religion, had real success only in the mid-12th century. With this conversion, the excesses of the Viking Age were moderated, and thanks to the introduction of the pen, many of that age's great successes could also now be documented. By far the largest and most interesting part of Old Norse literature was written in Iceland. Old Norse is unique among the Germanic languages in the volume and richness of its literature. Although it was not the first type to be written down, Eddic poetry probably represents the oldest preserved genre of Old Norse literature. Eddic poems, preponderantly short, dramatic, stanzaic, and alliterative, are found primarily in a single manuscript written shortly after 1250. Undoubtedly a copy of an older manuscript. The poems, broadly speaking, deal with two distinct but interrelated subjects: the gods and myths of Germanic heathendom, and the heroes of the Germanic age of the Great Migrations. Various scholars have assigned different poems to centuries ranging from the 9th to the 13th, from the Viking Age to the relatively settled age when the poems were actually written down rather than passed on by word of mouth. Their subject matter, of course, must be traced back to an even earlier period. Related to Eddic poetry in subject, though not in style, is the prose Edda of Snorri Sturluson. Written about 1220, this work has 3 parts. The first is a compilation of myths of the heathen world, told in prose with occasional poetic quotations. Its purpose in Snorri's Christian time was to give poets the necessary background to understand and use the mythological allusions so frequent in skaldic poetry. Indeed, the second part of his work, on poetic speech, makes this goal yet more explicit. He explains a number of presumably obscure allusions and attempts something of a classification of types of poetry. The heart of the third section is one long poem written in honor of Snorri's noble benefactors, and deliberately containing examples of all skaldic meters that Snorri could think of. Skaldic verse was an ancient genre by the time Snorri got around to writing the textbook for it. And indeed it may not be a much later genre than Eddic poetry. But if Eddic poetry represented the cultural heritage of the general populace, Skaldic poetry was definitely the province of the elite. Much Skaldic poetry deals with the exploits of kings and other patrons, and was clearly meant as praise poetry. Unlike Eddic poems, Skaldic poetry was episodic and descriptive, and supposedly, under the best circumstances, extemporaneous. Here Robinson writes that Skaldic poetry is easily among the most artificial forms of literature ever devised by human beings. Was a subject to very rigid rules of meter, alliteration, and rhyme, and deviated considerably from everyday syntax. Icelandic literature and writing, from its beginning, shows a great interest in that island and its history, and its inhabitants. The first notable historical work from Iceland is the Íslendingabók, or the Book of Icelanders, written about 1125 by Ari Thorgilsson, a priest. We only now possess a condensed version of the original work. The extant version, Ari gives a brief history of Iceland from its first settlement to his own day, and a history of the church in Iceland. He cites his sources very carefully, and in many cases draws from the oral testimony of his contemporaries, setting an exacting standard for historical writing. These standards were very rare in his day, but they were to have a great influence on later Icelandic writing. The original version of the Íslendingabók, Ari says, contained genealogies of Iceland's foremost families, all nobility, from the noble families of Norway, and a treatment of the lives of the Norwegian kings. Clear echoes of such writings appear in the later kings' sagas and family sagas. Probably the later Landnámabók, the Book of the Settlement, which exists in a number of 13th and 14th century versions, is at least partly based on work done by Ari, either in the lost first edition of the Íslendingabók or elsewhere. The Landnámabók contains not only lists of early settlers of Iceland, their land holdings and their descendants, but also descriptions of many of the people and of significant incidents in their lives. Historical and religious interests came together in the second half of the 12th century with the first of the Konungssögur, or Kings' Sagas, which deal with the two Norwegian kings, Olaf Tryggvason and Saint Olaf Haraldsson. Similarly, the lives of two Icelandic bishops possessed of saintly qualities were put down in sagas, as were the lives of other slightly less holy but equally pious early clerics of Iceland. Although the word saga etymologically means something said, it should be made clear that from the start that saga in the Icelandic tradition is actually a piece of prose literature, a deliberate composition by a particular author. Though there is much, much more Icelandic literature, we will have a look at Snorri's Edda. There are essentially two Edda poems, or works. The poetic Edda, or the older Edda, or sometimes known as the Zaimunda Edda, Elder Edda, is a collection of poems from the medieval Icelandic Codex Regius, the royal book. It is, to date, the most expansive source of Norse mythology. Though it was written about the 13th century, not much was known about it until about 1643, when it came into the possession of Björnfr Svensson. By that time, certain versions of the prose Edda were already well known in Iceland. The prose Edda, sometimes referred to as the Younger Edda, or Snorri's Edda, is what we shall read today. The part that we're reading concerns a Swedish king who is at a court being told about the history of the world and the gods, and how the world was created, and how the destruction and rebirth of this Norse mythical world is foretold. It relates how Odin and his people, the Aesir or Aesa and the Vanir, became the Swedes. It relates certain mythological occurrences that have often been related to geological happenings such as earthquakes or meteorites or floods. The king Gylfi appears to be duped in a certain way into accepting this Norse religion, but we can see, and it is believed, that this is a Christian perspective from Snorri, as he's writing to justify his treatment of the Old Norse mythology. Fra skiptum Thors og Skrymir lett han þar eftir hafra og byrjað. He left his goats there and went on his way east into Jotunheim, clear to the sea, and then he went on across the deep ocean and went ashore on the other side, together with Loki and Hjalfe and Roska. When they had proceeded a short distance, there stood before them a great wood, through which they kept going the whole day until dark. Thjalfe, who was of all men the fleetest of foot, bore Thor's bag, but the wood was no good place for provisions. When it had become dark, they sought a place for their night lodging, and found a very large hall. At the end of it was a door, as wide as the hall. Here they remained through the night. About midnight there was a great earthquake, and the ground trembled beneath them, and the house shook. Then Thor stood up and called his companions. They looked about them and found an adjoining room to the right, in the midst of the hall, and there they went in. Thor seated himself in the door. The others went farther in, and were very much frightened. Thor held his hammer by the handle, ready to defend himself. Then they heard a great groaning and roaring. When it began to dawn, Thor went out and saw a man lying not far from him in the wood. He was very large, lay sleeping, and snored loudly. Then Thor thought he had found out what noise it was that they had heard in the night. He girded himself with his megingjarter, whereby his assay might be increased. Meanwhile, the man woke and immediately arose. It is said that Thor once forbore to strike him with the hammer, and asked him for his name. He called himself Skrymir, but, said he, I do not need to ask you what your name is. I know that you are the Aesir, Thor. But what have you done with my glove? He stretched out his hand and picked up his glove. Then Thor saw that the glove was the hall in which he had spent the night, and that the adjoining room was the thumb of the glove. Skrymir asked whether they would accept of his company. Thor said yes. Skrymir took and then loosened his provision sack and began to eat his breakfast. But Thor and his fellows did the same in another place. Skrymir proposed that they should lay their store of provisions together, to which Thor consented. Then Skrymir bound all their provisions into one bag, laid it on his back, and led the way all the day, taking gigantic strides. Late in the evening he sought out a place for their night quarters under a large oak. Then Skrymir said to Thor that he wanted to lie down to sleep. They might take the provision sack and make ready their supper. Then Skrymir fell asleep and snored tremendously. When Thor took the provision sack and was to open it. Then happened what seems incredible, but still it must be told, that he could not get one knot loosened, nor could he stir a single end of the strings so that it was looser than before. When he saw that all his efforts were in vain, he became angry, seized his hammer Mjolnir with both hands, stepped 1 foot towards where Skrymir was lying, and dashed the hammer at his head. Skrymir awoke and asked whether some leaf had fallen upon his head, whether they had taken their supper and were ready to go to sleep. Thor answered that they were just going to sleep. Then they went under another oak. But the truth must be told that there was no fearless sleeping. About midnight, Thor heard that Skrymir was snoring and sleeping so fast that it thundered in the wood. He arose and went over to Skrymir, clutched the hammer tight and hard, and gave him a blow in the middle of the crown, so that he knew that the head of the hammer sank deep into his head. But just then Skrymir awoke and asked, "What is that? Did an acorn fall onto my head? How is it with you, Thor?" Thor hastened back, answered that he had just woken up, and said that it was midnight and still time to sleep. Then Thor made up his mind that if he could get a chance to give him the third blow, he should never see him again, and he now lay watching for Skrymir to sleep. Shortly before daybreak he heard that Skrymir had fallen asleep, so he arose and ran over to him. He clutched the hammer with all his might and dashed it at his temples, which he saw uppermost. The hammer sank up to the handle. Skrymir sat up, stroked his temples, and said, "Are there any birds sitting in the tree above me? Methought, as I woke, that some moss from the branches fell on my head. What, are you awake, Thor? It is now time to get up and dress, but you have not far left to the burg that is called Utgard. I have heard that you have been whispering among yourselves that I am not small of stature, but you will see greater men when you come to Utgard. Now I will give you wholesome advice. Do not brag too much of yourselves, for Utgard Loki's thanes will not brook the boasting of such insignificant little fellows as you are. Otherwise turn back, and that is in fact the best thing for you to do. But if you are bound to continue your journey, then keep straight on eastward. My way lies to the north, to those mountains that you see there." Skrymir then took the provision sack and threw it on his back, and, leaving them, turned into the wood, and it has not been learned whether the Asses wished to meet him again in health. In essence, Old Norse has many similarities to Old Gothic, or Gothic, which we discussed in a previous video. What we see in Old Norse are different sounds of consonants, and the voiceless stops, P, T, K, often lacking voicing. In Gothic, there was a rule that certain short vowels appeared only before certain consonants, while other vowels never appeared in these positions. But in Old Norse, there is very little sign of consonantal conditioning of vowels, which means that the consonants had very specific and precedental pronunciation rules. Certain processes are shown to have taken place with the I O, U umlauts, as well as the A. So the vowels have different sounds than they would in Gothic. And in some places, there is no final syllable, such as in the Gothic sig gevan. In the Old Norse, it's singen or sing. Let's have a look at some of these words and their cognates from the Old Norse, the Gothic, and modern English or German. Let's look at some Old Norse words. Deer. That's our Old Norse. And the Gothic equivalent of that. Deuce. And our modern English. Animal. And this is where we get the actual deer. It's a cognate word, but it doesn't mean the same thing anymore. Let's look at another one. Varu. Veson. And this is the past tense of to be, were. And we get the modern German noun, Wesen, a being. Leggja. Leggja, leggjan. And in English, lay. This is a transitive verb to lay something, or it can also mean a saga, a poetry. Here's a good one. I think you'll like this one. And I do beg pardon for my substandard Norse accent or pronunciation, lack thereof. Ikja. Ikja. And we do have a Gothic equivalent for this word. Ukjan. You can see the last syllable of the Gothic is much stronger than that of the Old Norse, as well as my ink at the moment. Well, this one means the meaning in modern English, not necessarily the cognate word, to think. Ukjan in Gothic and ikja. As you can see, we have a falling away of that final vowel and sometimes syllable. How about this one? translates to ganz. We have that nasal coming through, and it's also in modern German ganz, which is a little bit more aspirated. Ganz, ganz, Old High German and English. Goose. How about another one? We only have one vowel in the word, but you might hear more vowel sounds in armor. Armor. Does that sound like anything? Well, our Gothic for this armor. Arms. Arms. And we have the Old High German for the same thing. Arm. And we know this in Latin as arma. In English, arm or armor as a cognate word, armor. So we have a lot of fighting cognate words, because as we've seen, the Danes brought these words and their culture into England. That was at the time a mix of Old Saxon and an Anglo-Germanic dialect, as well as bits of Celtic and what was left of the Latin, the insular Latin that had been spoken long ago. Let's do a funny one. Goddyr, Goddyr. Think about the Danish army coming into England again. And we have gods in Gothic. Good Old High German. And somewhat archaic modern German, Güte. And English, good. Goods. Not necessarily good as in bonus, good. It's a good thing, but goods as in the supplies. And here we can also spell this armar. We have that final syllable, and that will be the plural. Arms. So you see, when we leave that almost Gothic, the Gothic would be armos, armar, arms. Old High German, arma. Here you can not only see how the Old High German is closer to the Old Norse, but also how much more accented those final syllables would have been in the Gothic, according to their orthography. What little we have of it. Let's do another one. Something interesting. Let's do some Old English cognates. Mick. And let's do our modern German. Does that sound like anything you might recognize in modern German? Certainly mich. Old English and modern English are the same here. Me. Me. And of course the Old Norse and modern German have case difference. This one is accusative. And with the Old Norse, the dative is slightly different. And that's where we get our English me. The dative is me. So you can see the me, which is the same in Old English, me, for the dative and accusative, is slightly different in the Old Norse. What about the accusative for you? We no longer have any inflection for this pronoun in English, you, but the Old Norse did. Thick. Old English will be, get some more ink. They, and of course, Middle English, the, you in the accusative. And these, again, were the same in the dative, whereas the Old Norse makes the distinction between the dative thick and, the accusative thick and the dative there. And we get this in modern German as well. Dich. Do modern German over here. So dich. And our dative of you, this is you singular, is dir. So you can see how the Old Norse and modern German pronouns are closer than the Old English, where the inflection has fallen away. The manner of writing that we're going to be looking at is the runes. It is debated about how the runes came into existence, or the runic alphabet, the futak. There have been proposed origins ranging from Greece, from the Marcomanni tribes, the Cimbri, and the Herulaeans. Some scholars believe they are Latin or Greek origins, and some scholars believe in Germanic tribal origins. But it is a continuing subject of insoluble debate. I'll write these runes and also the names of the study special patrons. If you would like to watch more runes in the study, I'll put a link to the video. say thank you to everyone watching. Thank you for everyone who supports the study. And a big thank you to Pirate Gary, David M. Carman, and Romulus. Thank you, my friend, for coming once again to the study and sharing some history and sounds and writing. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. Be good to yourself. Be kind to others.